There's a strange paradox within us all, where we'll often go to great lengths to avoid feeling vulnerable, even if it means facing rejection head-on. Beneath this surface-level fear lies a deeply ingrained pattern, a desperate need for control over our emotions, rather than risking the possibility of rejection and the pain that comes with it. You may have seen this play out in your own life, perhaps with a friend who consistently pushes people away just before things get too close, or with a loved one who's unable to open up without feeling like it's a weakness. As we delve into the dark psychology of emotional insecurity and attachment, we'll uncover the hidden motives and motivations that fuel this fear, and the startling truths that people rarely dare to whisper out loud. When we claim to fear rejection more than vulnerability, it's often a veiled attempt to avoid confronting the true source of our emotional insecurity, the desperate need for validation from others to compensate for our own internal lack. People often prioritize maintaining the illusion of control over their emotions and relationships, rather than genuinely risking intimacy and connection, because it serves as a coping mechanism for the anxiety that comes with acknowledging our own emotional vulnerabilities. The fear of vulnerability has become an addiction, as it provides us with a false sense of security, allowing us to project our insecurities onto others and avoid confronting the darker aspects of our own character. In reality, the price we pay for emotional security is often our own attraction, as we become so focused on maintaining an idealized image of ourselves that we sacrifice the very things that bring us authentic connection and intimacy. The irony is that our deep-seated fear of rejection is, in fact, rooted in our fear of exposure, which stems from a profound self-deception that we're already acceptable and worthy, when in truth, the validation we crave is an attempt to fill a gaping void within ourselves. By rejecting genuine emotional intimacy, we inadvertently reinforce the very patterns that perpetuate our emotional insecurity, effectively locking ourselves in a cycle of self-doubt, anxiety, and perpetual longing for external validation. We're drawn to vulnerability because it offers us a fleeting sense of control over the emotional chaos that threatens our very sense of identity. For many, rejection is not the actual source of fear, but rather the vulnerability that precedes it, because in exposing ourselves, we surrender to the uncertainty of being deemed unworthy. In our desperate search for validation, we convince ourselves that we can't afford to be vulnerable because it leaves us open to hurt, yet what we're really fearing is the dissolution of our carefully constructed ego. Our aversion to vulnerability stems not just from the risk of rejection, but also from the exposure it demands of our authentic, imperfect selves, and the perceived loss of control it would imply. What we often overlook is that our avoidance of vulnerability not only prevents us from truly connecting with others, but also sabotages our capacity for genuine intimacy and attraction, which can only begin once we let our guard down. The paradox is stark. Our attempts at self-protection through emotional isolation and invincibility not only fortify our defenses, but also trap us in a cycle of self-deception, further reinforcing our fear of the very thing that could liberate us: vulnerability. When we're taught to suppress emotions, vulnerability becomes a threat to our carefully crafted facade. People often fear vulnerability because it requires an admission of their own emotional fragility, something many are unwilling to confront. The pursuit of connection and intimacy is inherently tied to the need for validation, but what happens when our sense of self-worth is inextricably linked to external validation? This dynamic fuels our anxiety about being rejected and intensifies our fear of vulnerability. One of the most insidious effects of trauma on attachment is the development of a distorted sense of self, where the line between self and others becomes blurred. In these cases, the need for control can masquerade as a need for intimacy. The notion that men are less vulnerable due to societal expectations of masculinity is a myth with a grain of truth. but it's also a self-deception that obscures the complexity of their emotional lives. The fear of being perceived as weak can make it nearly impossible for men to explore their vulnerability. For women, the societal expectation to be nurturing and empathetic can become a double-edged sword. The pressure to be supportive of others' vulnerabilities while hiding their own can reinforce their fear of vulnerability. The result is a stifled expression of emotions, creating a vicious cycle of insecurity and disconnection. The root of our fear of vulnerability lies not in rejection, but in the exposure of our true selves. When we're not afraid of rejection, we're more likely to be drawn to intimacy because we're not terrified of being seen as weak or inadequate. Here are 6 spoken sentences that could fit into the dark psychology of power dynamics in relationships section of the video. People struggle with vulnerability because it forces them to acknowledge a deep-seated fear of abandonment, a primal insecurity that echoes deep within their psyche. The notion of opening up and being receptive only serves to amplify their fear of losing control in the relationship, thus reinforcing their defensive strategies. It's often not rejection that people fear most, but the feeling of being utterly unshielded and exposed to the unpredictable nature of human connection. Those who claim to be more confident and self-assured often employ self-deception as a coping mechanism, concealing their underlying fears and insecurities behind a thin veil of bravado. When individuals become overly fixated on maintaining power in a relationship, it's often because they've lost touch with their authentic emotional needs, substituting control for connection and validation. We are drawn to the unknown, yet terrified of it, and this paradox is precisely why vulnerability can be so disorienting. It requires us to confront our own vulnerability, our own potential for hurt, and our own limitations. When we're afraid to be vulnerable, it's often because we're terrified of confronting the parts of ourselves we've disowned, the pieces of our identity we've hidden even from ourselves. Our avoidance of vulnerability stems less from a genuine fear of rejection, but more from a desperate attempt to maintain control over the narrative of our lives, where our ego is threatened by the very act of showing our true selves. Deep down, we're trying to shield ourselves from the painful truth that our sense of self-worth is predicated on external validation, that our value as individuals is defined by the opinions and reactions of others. The truth is, we're not as attracted to intimacy as we are repelled by the fear of being exposed, of being seen without the carefully curated mask we wear to navigate the world. Our attachment to invulnerability is a misguided attempt to safeguard against the perceived threat of emotional injury, when in reality, it's the very act of opening ourselves up that allows us to truly form meaningful connections with others. By embracing vulnerability, we begin to see that our insecurities are not a weakness, but a profound invitation to confront the fragmented and often unacknowledged aspects of our own psyche, to integrate the disparate parts of our being and emerge stronger, more whole, and more compassionate. Thank you for joining me today on this journey to uncover the hidden forces driving our deepest fears. Remember, vulnerability may be uncomfortable, but rejecting the possibility of connection and intimacy can be even more damaging to our relationships, our mental health, and ourselves. If you found this video insightful, be sure to like, share your observations in the comments below, and subscribe for more in-depth explorations of human psychology and the complexities of the human experience.